I'm very happy to kind of relive the experience of several months ago at PBIRG at the annual meeting, because it gives me the opportunity again to talk about two things that I'm really quite passionate about and I live on a day-to-day basis. The first of which is in the title, and that's the notion of competitive readiness. You know, as a market researcher, that's pretty much what we do. We make sure that the products are both our developmental products and our inline products are competitively ready. And what I want to do is share with you some of, I guess, the insights that I've experienced, that I've come to over the course of the last several years to really optimize competitive readiness. One of the themes of the original annual meeting, or the annual meeting of several months ago, was an emerging market type focus as well. So what you're going to see in a lot of cases when I talk about competitive readiness, I also talk about another passion of mine, and that is the notion that we need to ensure competitive readiness across a variety of different markets, now not just the US, the G5, Japan, and so on, but truly emerging markets and all the challenges that that is going to present. So one of the things that I do need to mention is that there's a lot of information here, and it's my thinking that they provided you with the slide deck. So I think most of what's in here I'm going to cover. If I don't cover something, certainly you have that for reference, and any questions that you might want to ask along the way, very much welcomed. So from a competitive readiness standpoint, the way I tend to think about it is that it's a combination of strategies, message, and tactics in order to optimize the performance of a brand. And as Kai had mentioned, I've been at this for about 17 years. Feels like 27 or 37. And there's been some realizations throughout those years. When I think competitive readiness, when I first got into this business, I thought of wargaming. I think that maybe that was my naivete at the time. But that's really what I thought about. Late stage, after development of the promotional platform, message and tactics, really to develop to inoculate your brand against the competition. And it had very much at the time, and especially now to me, very much of an insular focus, very much focused in on our product, pretty much had blinders on, at least I did at the time. And by the time we got to wargaming, objection handling, whatever you want to call it, it was very much my sense that the horses were already out of the barn. Yes, here are the objections to our product, but in a lot of cases, we're not optimally suited to do anything about it. So what I've been doing, and many of you have as well over the course of the last many years, is to ensure that competitive readiness starts much earlier. Early stage and throughout product development, marketing research certainly to inform opportunity assessment, product development, and promotional platform development as well. And it's very much a comprehensive market focus in developing the product and the promotional platform. And I'll go into a fair amount of detail about that shortly. But over the course of many of those years, for me personally, it's very much been a US or established market focus. So I get the sense that some of the horses are still in the barn, but some of the horses are out of the barn. So what I've been focusing in on in the last couple years, largely by necessity, because that's where my clients are going, is more of a global competitive readiness focus. A market with the realization that market revenue and growth are reliant on the emerging markets. We all recognize that these markets differ dramatically, and it's really early stage research to understand and prioritize the opportunity in these markets, subsequent research to ensure competitive readiness, and then it's really a global platform with a local flavor. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is trying to figure out how to do emerging market research, global market research in a very cost-effective way. So with all of our challenging budgets these days, we're not breaking the bank now going from 7 markets to 24 markets where our growth potential is. So again, a fair amount of detail to follow there as well. I'm going to date myself a little bit more other than Kai's comments here. I had a favorite comedian probably 15, 20 years ago. Some of you probably remember, he's still around a little bit. His name is Stephen Wright. He's got a very dry sense of humor, and one of his jokes was, I have a house on the median strip of a highway. I have to leave my driveway going 65 miles an hour. So from my standpoint, I like to think about late stage wargaming type research as being that house on the median strip of the driveway. If I wait to contemplate competitive readiness until a later stage, I'm having to leave my driveway at 65 miles an hour, which is a very dangerous situation to be in. And when you overlay that on global competitive readiness, when you talk about emerging markets, same house, same median, but I don't understand the signs. So it's an even more dangerous situation, not only if we don't do competitive readiness early, but if we don't do it, if we don't address the issue in these global markets, in these emerging markets. I think probably some of my comments have already spoken to this issue. I think competitive readiness is largely evolved in a lot of our minds. It's certainly something that I like to instill upon everybody that I work with. I think we think about this morning, noon, and night within our four walls. It's an everyday mindset. We're focused on getting the right answers. And I feel we have established methodologies to ensure competitive readiness. The sort of is a big sort of. I want to talk with you a little bit about my frustration with typical methodologies like target product profile testing and those sorts of things, because I think there are better solutions than that type of research. Emerging markets, it's certainly much more evolving. It's an emerging mindset. Also, I think very much so these days, we're learning to ask the right questions. I don't even necessarily want the answers right now. I want to understand how to ask the right questions. And I think the folks that learn how to ask the right questions, thus getting the right answers, are very much at a competitive advantage in the market these days. And it's certainly influencing our methodologies as well. And I strongly believe, again, for everybody sitting in this room, people on the consulting side, people on the client side, there's a true commitment required on both fronts, both competitive readiness and also in these ex-US emerging markets as well. So in terms of the overall presentation, what I hope folks to walk away with is that competitive readiness has never been more important, and I would argue never been more difficult at this point in time. The key principles of competitive readiness, also the key principles of emerging marketing research, and finally an overview of marketing research best practices to optimize competitive readiness. And I think what I'll probably end up doing is focusing a lot of my emphasis down on that last point, the overview of what I believe to be the best practices based on my experience. Why has competitive readiness never been more important? Certainly, as we all know, there's a decline in the development of blockbusters. We are faced with products that don't sell themselves. There's an increasingly crowded therapeutic areas and lack of clear differentiation, increasing generic penetration and a push towards use of generics. Faced with growth challenges, a premium is placed on protecting that which we have. I can't tell you how many times that I've had clients come to me and say, we need to do marketing research because our product is not growing. I'm sure we've all said it, we've all heard it. And associated with that is an inflection in the voice as if the sky is falling. I think in a lot of cases, sometimes the sky is falling, but in a number of cases, the notion of holding on to what you have can be a win. It might not be a capital W win, but it's certainly a win depending on the market in today's environment. So very much a focus on protecting that which we have. Never been more important because of shrinking pharma budgets as well. If there's one statement in this entire deck that I really try to preach, and not just because it's incredibly self-serving, is that you should have an early focus on competitive readiness because it offers the promise of better, more informed investment and development decisions. I know there's a finite budget out there, but I hope, and I'm seeing, gone are the days of doing 10 days of creative concept testing, hopefully with more of an emphasis on some of this early stage marketing research to better inform investment in products by way of clinical trials. I literally did, this was probably not more than, probably about 8 years ago, for one product over the course of 6 to 8 months, we did 22 days of creative concept testing. Again, I think those days are gone, and I hope those days have been replaced with very much more of an emphasis on this early stage research. Increasingly restrictive government policies, very important as well. The emergence and proliferation of targeted therapy as well. I personally do a lot of work in oncology, and then when you think of targeted therapy, I tend to think of oncology. You know, now a lot of these products are not playing in that 100% market share space where you're competing for everybody. Oftentimes your product is appropriate for 10%, 20%, 30% of the patient population. you need to optimize your competitive readiness within that space to have a commercially viable and a commercially successful product. A need to ensure growth in emerging markets, certainly as well. Readiness requires a detailed understanding of these markets. The nature of the opportunity is likely to differ by market. I think one of the things that I say later in this deck is, if you've seen one market, you've seen one market. I know it's nice when you're going to do research in Europe to say, I can take the findings from this market and generalize them to another. As I focus in on the emerging markets, I have a lot of trepidation in doing so. So again, I think that places a premium on understanding all of these markets, but certainly in a cost-effective way. This is an important one, I think, that the company presence and reputation can have a significant impact on product receptivity and use, especially in emerging and developing countries. I know we've all been in research on one side of the glass or the other, where doctors say some variant of, I don't care who makes it, I just care what it does, I just care about its benefits, that sort of thing. Well, when you do research in emerging markets, that is a little bit reversed. There is some value in having a good reputation among key customers in emerging markets. They will often base the purchasing decision on company reputation, on the sense that this company has a critical mass in my market. So I think that's very important as well. There's an increasingly worldwide access to our product information and promotional messages as well, again, thus putting a premium on our competitive readiness. It's also never been more difficult from my standpoint. There's incredible heterogeneity in the landscape as we make the necessary move to these developing markets. Again, we need to ask the right questions to get the right answers. Obtaining the right answers, again, assumes that we are asking the right questions. The pharmaceutical biotechnology industry exists within a largely Western framework. It's interesting, in doing research in places like Turkey and Poland and Venezuela and Brazil and Mexico, you talk with the physicians, you talk with your moderators, you talk with healthcare professionals about things like positioning, competitive readiness, unique selling proposition, all these sorts of things that have to do with competition and competitive readiness. It's often cases a very unique, very new, very different language, which makes it very challenging to do this type of research, to build a promotional platform in these emerging markets. Back to my shrinking pharma budget, why never more difficult? There's the temptation to view must-have competitive research as nice to have or need not have. We need to avoid that temptation. Also, there's an increasing tendency to accomplish as much as possible in one study. I know none of us have ever done that, but relative to 10 years ago, the multifaceted study, I think, is becoming the norm rather than the exception. Let's do some positioning. Let's try to get messaging out of the way. Maybe we can get a read on our creative concepts, and I've got several logos I want to evaluate too. And if we have any time left, we can cover something else. So again, very difficult to optimize competitive readiness in that environment. There's an absence of reliable sources of information to inform marketing research study design in a lot of these emerging markets. One of the things that I think I'm going to argue very shortly is, for people on my side of the business, there's a tremendous opportunity to carve out that space, to really position oneself as the experts in emerging markets, not just in understanding the landscape of those markets, but also in terms of understanding the product-specific opportunities within each of those markets. That's something that we're certainly building toward. That's something that we're trying to do. I admit, however, that it's a developmental process, and there's a lot of opportunity out there for others as well. It's difficult to acquire the discipline of appropriate focus on the forest and the trees. Again, we've all been in meetings where we're trying to figure out the global positioning platform or promotional platform, and we're having to take into account US versus G5. In a lot of cases now, we're having to wrap our arms around the emerging markets as well to figure out what that global positioning, that global promotional strategy looks like. This is a really interesting one, and it's one that I've come up with recently. I do a lot of research in portfolio platform development. So you take the challenge of trying to position a product, and now you're trying to position a portfolio of 2, 3, 4, 5 products. When you think about the emerging markets, when we think about the emerging markets specifically, we're making a decision to go into these emerging markets all at once. So we're now just not, in the US, we're sequentially trying to position products as they become available. In a lot of these emerging markets, we're faced with the need to position the portfolio all at once, which again is a very difficult endeavor. Just a few words, which I won't focus too much on, in terms of the emerging markets, why they have never been so important. You look at some of the numbers that I've got up here, what you'll see is that most of the growth that's forecasted in the pharmaceutical industry is very much focused in on these emerging markets. So you'll see, I think the third sub-bullet there, they're known as the Far-Emerging 17, is forecast to be valued at the same value as Japan and Europe by mid-decade. So certainly there's a lot of need to emphasize these emerging markets, and a lot of our clients are doing so. And also it's very important to point out that most major pharmaceutical companies remain underexposed in opportunity-rich emerging markets. Borrowing a little bit of data and a little bit of estimation here from our friends at IMS, we see that European pharma companies are generally regarded to have a greater exposure in these emerging markets than companies based in the US, but there the exposure rate is still only 15 to 30%. They have an advantage, but there's a lot of opportunity for a competitive advantage, both in the short term and long term in these markets. And I think qualitatively as well, the markets are evolving, many of them quickly. Very important to understand them. The emerging markets are very heterogeneous, as we talked about. There are key barriers to market entry within each emerging market. The treatment area and product opportunities will differ by market. Strongly feel that pharmaceutical companies need to prioritize and establish a footprint in each of these markets as well. I think one of the other important things when you think about it from a competitive readiness standpoint is that the laddering of the product benefits and promises will differ by market. Because my positioning platform focused on quality of life plays very well in the United States and Europe, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate well to places like Venezuela, Mexico, and so on. The pharma companies also need to identify country-specific expectations and need for the products as well. I've been doing a fair amount of vaccine research lately, and one of the things, if anybody's been involved in vaccines, that you see in some of these markets is a lot of the countries care about where the vaccine has been studied, the patients it's been studied in. So there's another country-specific expectation and need that needs to be taken into account. Technology has made it a small world as well, another reason why emerging markets are very important. And a focus on emerging markets offers the compelling promise of a customized global strategy. Just a few words, I think, from a few more words about the emerging market focus is that the pundits, whoever those pundits may be that I've read, are basically saying that there are 7 common keys to success for the emerging markets. And if you look at this, I think the list certainly applies to pharmaceutical manufacturers, but I think it applies to people on my side of the business, on the consultant side of the business as well. Make a commitment and do it early. Understand the local market, each is unique. Leverage the global portfolio, then add local value. Segment the markets based on product class opportunity. Define the customer, establish right price points, and manage locally. From a prioritization standpoint, this is more for your reference, I think, than anything. These are the criteria that are currently being used by most to prioritize ex-US countries. And what that typically results in is this tiered prioritization of these countries where most companies are focusing. Tier 1 we all know well, and Tier 2 has seen a proliferation of emphasis and certainly marketing research from my side of things as well over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. Countries also help us, the countries themselves have also helped to define the opportunity. And that's really what I'm doing here. I'm moving toward trying to define the opportunity in these emerging markets. The governments themselves have listed the therapeutic areas that they would like to focus in on, that they've been targeted for improvement. However, that's the government's emphasis in each of these countries. How about our emphasis? There's residual prioritization issues. It's a rough measure of the opportunity, but it's important nuances within tier to inform and prioritize the opportunity. But to further prioritize the opportunity, we need to basically understand the opportunity for our products. The governments have no interest in the opportunity for our products. So a necessary part of the solution is an integration of emerging markets into our competitive readiness initiatives. So let's talk about some of the competitive readiness key principles and best practice methodologies. And importantly as well, if you have a US focus, these are all applicable. If you have an emerging market or an ex-US focus, these are, in my way of thinking, all applicable as well. I think key principles, I'll start off somewhat high level, and we'll get down into granularity when we talk a little bit about some specific methodologies. In terms of key principles, it's never too early to follow the competitive readiness beacon. One of the things that again, we often are being tasked to do, and I think importantly so, is to get involved very early to identify the nature of the opportunity. One of the things that I notice a lot in conducting an hour IDI or a 2-hour focus group is there is a rush through setup of the competitive landscape in the interest of talking about our product. Everybody wants to hear about our product. But it's my contention that if we don't take the 10, 15, dare I say 20 minutes to set up the competitive landscape in the mind of the respondent, then what we get is garbage. Because they're not telling us how to position the product in the context of the competitive landscape. They're not telling us how to message it. They're not giving us a good indication of the likely placement and fit. So one of the things that I often counsel is let's take time to set up the competitive environment. It might be a one-page product description for a product, 2 products. Start to sweat when I hear 3 products because it's a lot of information, but it's important information in the context of research. Take steps to make competitive readiness viral within the organization. I know we've all had experiences with this in our past where we go to a positioning workshop. We have a wargaming workshop, something like that. And the real knowledgeable people in the room about competitive readiness are the people that have had to live it for the last several years. These are typically the marketing folks, the marketing research folks. But when you look around the room, there's medical folks, there's clinical folks, there's R&D folks that are very much involved in these meetings in the day-to-day life as well. These people really need to understand the competitive readiness notion because they're trying to deliver on a product that is truly unique in clinically important ways to motivate preferential prescribing of the agent. So again, I think it's very important to make things viral within the organization. Fight the again, a self-serving statement for the 3rd time perhaps. Fight the urge to de-emphasize and not fund early-stage competitive readiness research. I think I just mentioned identify the field on which the game will be played. In other words, set up the competitive environment. Avoid biasing the customer before needed. This is probably the one realization that I've had over the course of the last 3 or 4 years that's probably helped me the most on a day-to-day basis in the marketing research context as I'm sitting in front of the physician. More detail on this shortly, but I've mentioned that I'm not a big fan of target product profile research. What I like to do, what I think we should do, is let the customer talk first about their requirements before us biasing them about what our product delivers. And again, I've got a bit of a methodological, some methodological detail to share with you shortly. Certainly recognize and expect and document segment-specific and market-specific opportunities and challenges from a competitive readiness standpoint. Strive for the global strategy, but realize you're going to need to engage in some degree of local customization as well, especially as we move to emerging markets. This is perhaps the most challenging one, and everybody has the best of intentions, is to take time to think, summarize, achieve buy-in, and plan, especially as we move to emerging markets. But even if it's just a US focus, the idea of from start to stop, doing a positioning study, for example, or a message testing study, we need to get it done in 3 weeks. That's not possible from an emerging standpoint. I would argue it's not only not optimal, not especially possible if you want to do it well, even in the US. So from a competitive readiness standpoint, build in some of that time to think. Recognize that some competitors are right down the hall. And probably obviously what I mean by that is there's a portfolio issue here. Especially, and I think almost every company has this issue of in at least one therapeutic area, more than one product that could potentially compete for the same space. I love to debate portfolio research. There's a lot of people in the industry that says a portfolio strategy is a really good idea. There's a lot of people that say portfolio strategy is garbage. Let every product compete for itself. I'm not going to argue one way or the other, but I think what I will argue is that you need to contemplate the potential benefits and downfalls of a portfolio strategy and build that into your marketing research. And again, a little bit more on that shortly. Evaluate the nature of the opportunity. We may need to build the market and category before share becomes optimally meaningful. And I think, again, another important realization in here, especially as we put together US research with ex-US research, a lot of times the research, the fundamental messages to build the commercial platform may differ in the US versus these other markets. I've seen this a lot in the last couple of years, where the US messages, rightly so, are very much focused on trying to displace a specific product to gain market share. In a lot of the other markets, a lot more of the messages are devoted to disease state messages, to educate physicians, to educate consumers, because it's not a battle for market share, it's a battle for market growth initially in a lot of these emerging markets. Don't just look at the main effects, but also the interactions again. Reactions may differ by market, by physician specialties, and so on. And I'm sure everybody has been in this situation, and I've been fortunate enough, I think, to be in the front room interviewing the physician or the customer in general while this conversation goes on in the back room. There is really no evidence. This is coming often from the lips and the mouth of the physician. There is really no evidence that this product is effective in that patient type. The product has not been evaluated against the standard of care. I would not replace what I'm doing right now. There is no data to suggest that your product is effective after the current of standard of care. That's very common in oncology. And very importantly, I find this positioning concept unique and important, but there is very little evidence that this claim is true. And what is often overheard in the back room as well, often from some senior level director of marketing or vice president type, why didn't we measure that in clinical trials? If I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times, some variant thereof. And what I'd like to talk about are some methodologies to make sure that we don't hear those types of things in the back room when we're 12 months, when we're 16, when we're 18 months away from product launch. We hear that before phase 3 clinical trial design has been etched in stone, so we have the power to do something about this and not hear it. So from, again, kind of getting to a little bit more level of granularity, the solution is an integrated early stage marketing research program to optimize competitive readiness. I won't deal a lot with the next couple slides, because from a market focus, these are specifically market landscape buying process type studies that we're probably all familiar with. There is a twist when it comes to emerging markets, but certainly we want to understand the buying process. We want to understand the nature of the opportunities at each step and also the challenges and how our product might be able to fit in and address those issues. But from a product focus standpoint, and here's where I will place most of my emphasis, is that product profile research is needed to inform the design of phase 3 clinical trials. I believe it's a must-have, and I think a lot of you probably feel it's a must-have as well. I'm going to talk about a little twist on that. It's conducted in the prioritized markets, including emerging. What I really like to focus in on are the minimal requirements of the brand to ensure trial and hopefully adoption, the key drivers by patient and situation type, and often an allocation used to inform the forecast model as well. Again, a lot more detail here shortly. One of the things that I've unfortunately seen go by the wayside, much to my chagrin, because I love this type of research and I used to do a lot of it probably 8 to 10 years ago, is what I would term, because I never had a better name for it, pre-positioning research. So this is not your final positioning. Ultimately what it is going out there before phase 3 clinical trial design. If you go out there with the target product profile, what you're essentially looking for are benefits, are strengths of your product, are things that you need to demonstrate in clinical trials to make physicians receptive to the product. In my way of thinking, it's a quantum leap, maybe smaller than quantum, but a leap from the benefits and the strengths of your product to the mind space that you want to occupy among customers. So what I used to love to do is pre-positioning research, and essentially what you do is you tick off, here is what is most compelling to physicians, prompting most enthusiasm to use your product. You're not looking for a winner, you're looking for winners. Here's first place, here's second place, here's third place. The important part of that discussion is doctor, patient, what do you need to see coming out of clinical trials to support each of those positioning concepts? Loved to do that type of research. I thought it was a great success story in a lot of cases for a lot of very successful products. And I would counsel, if you can swing something like this early stage, and you may even be able to, here I'm going to go back on what I said before, you may be even able to tag it on to the end of a 45-minute interview in the interest of 15 minutes. Kind of give me your reaction, top of mind reaction to each of these ideas, each of these themes. Briefly, what would you need to see demonstrated to support them? I love that type of research, and I thought it was very actionable and useful as well. So just real briefly, in terms of the market landscape, again, I know we all know market landscape and buying process studies very well. We're looking all the way from patient origination through diagnosis, through treatment, through resolution and ongoing follow-up. They're customized, commissioned for a product portfolio. They're conducted usually in select markets, and you might be able to see where I'm going here. Conducted in select markets, usually the US and partial G5, as we start to think about other markets, emerging markets. I don't think there's a lot of budgetary dollars out there to do this type of research the way we do it right now in 17 and 24 different countries. So we need to do it a better way. And again, I'll share with some of my thoughts shortly on that. Ideally, it captures the physician and the patient perspective. I often like to use patient records in doing the buying process type research. Focuses in on the opportunities and the challenges, and it provides initial guidance in regard to competitive readiness as well. So market landscape studies in emerging market world, it's really a two-step process. We're trying to prioritize initial customized research with the full set of markets to prioritize the product portfolio. To make it cost effective, the way we've been doing it and the way we're starting to do it is do it quantitatively, first of all. Again, our clients don't have the budgets to do market landscape research in 10, 15, 16, 17 different countries. So what we typically do from a much more cost-effective standpoint is do that quantitatively, first of all, to kind of narrow down the playing field and prioritize for the initial market landscape. And again, the primary goal is to prioritize the markets for further exploration and product introduction. And I think one of the things that I will predict will happen in the next several years is that this will become a syndicated offering developed by somebody. Again, I don't think anybody is there yet, but I think in combination with what I'm going to talk about here shortly, I think it will eventually become a syndicated product. And then in step two, what we've typically done is, from an evaluation standpoint, is for each product or portfolio in those prioritized markets is very much turned to qualitative marketing research at that point. So you've narrowed down a list of 16 target markets down to maybe 4, 5, 6, 8. Then you can do it more cost effectively qualitatively to fill in some of the details. The primary goal is further prioritization and initial sense of the product and process requirements in each of those countries. And again, this gets back to what I had mentioned before about my syndicated prediction. Why the need for a prospective approach? Again, customized ad hoc research is inefficient from a market landscape standpoint. There's currently an absence of an integrated worldview. I think if I had the entire universe of consultants, of vendors in this room, some might quibble with the fact that there is an unmet need here. But I think when you combine these two things, I think there are companies that understand market dynamics in these other countries quite well. I think there's companies that are very capable of identifying treatment area and product-specific opportunities within each of these markets as well. I would contend, and I think I would be right about this, is that there's no company on my side of the business that does both of those things very well. So again, I think companies that have those dual capabilities will very much be at a competitive advantage. because our pharma clients are very much looking for the answers to those fundamental questions: where to invest, how to invest, and when to invest as well. In conducting marketing research, what we often take for granted in the U.S. needs to be emphasized in emerging markets. Again, I know a lot of us have a U.S. focus, and you know, if you close your eyes and look at that typical 5-6 page qualitative discussion guide, the physician in practice background section, what, it's about that big. Tell me a little bit about your practice. How many patients do you have? Now on to the interesting stuff. I think in the emerging markets, that physician in practice background, that market environment, that market landscape section becomes much larger, because we don't collectively, we're gaining this, we don't collectively have a complete understanding in all these markets about all of these very important issues. For example, these are realizations that I've had maybe over the course of, just examples, over the course of the last probably several months. In Russia, different decision makers in what are called S1 and S2 hospitals. There's also different decision makers when you think about the types of products they're using versus the brand. Didn't know that as of, maybe as of a year ago, until I started doing some research in Russia. In many cultures, patients are generally unwilling to acknowledge and accept illness. They're much more interested in the safety and tolerability of the medication. So when you hear physicians in the US say efficacy, 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 it's always about efficacy first. There's a temptation to want to generalize that to the rest of the world. Certainly not always the case. Very interesting as well, the very notion of having alternatives or the opportunity to customize one's approach is very much valued in a lot of these emerging markets, where we take alternatives and choice as a given. A lot of those physicians don't. From a competitive advantage standpoint, what that's meant for a few of my clients is that's helped inform the decision: do I go in with my product that I think will sell best in these emerging markets, or do I go in with a portfolio? All else being equal, this notion of that physicians in Russia and elsewhere value alternatives is very much a reason to pursue the portfolio for the two clients that I'm thinking about. And as you can see, all of these questions have very strong implications for targeting and tactical implications, and also positioning and messaging implications as well. I think in the interest of time, I think we probably know most of this information. I'm going to skip to the next slide. So from a competitive readiness standpoint, and I'll call this Competitive Readiness 101, I talked a little bit about before must-have research, customer requirements for product use, nice to have being the pre-positioning studies. As I hope I've made the point so far, these must be conducted in the context of the launch environment, and it's really important to have that primary customer input for trial design. It's really a key driver of trial design. And here's where I started to talk a little bit about this before, and I won't get into the real fine-grained nitty-gritty here in terms of the methodology itself, but the customer requirement research that I grew up with was target product profile research. And I think it's largely still the context in which a lot of research is being done today as well. You take a product profile, there's the mandate to put it on one page, so it's in 6 font. The physician scrutinizes it, and what they often say, and I've heard it many, many times, they take 2 minutes to read it, and you say, well, what do you think? Looks good to me. What do you mean? Well, what do you think about the efficacy data? It looks really good. In my way of thinking, the target product profile really stifles creativity, and it stifles critical thinking as well. And if you think about it, what we've done in putting the product profile in front of the customer is tell them what's important. We've kind of painted them into a box. We've told them what's important about the product. We've told them what we think they think should be important. And what I often find much more gratifying is to allow the customer to take the wheel first. We do this in the context of developing, I guess what I would call a kind of a generalized, kind of minimal expectation of the product to ensure product use. And it's literally, it feels better for everybody involved in the research. It's literally, and most importantly me, because it gets me through the day and I'm very happy by the end of it, It's literally the moderator getting up and saying, I want you to tell me about your minimal expectations for product use. I'm not writing things up on the board initially like efficacy, safety, tolerability. I'm allowing them to populate the attributes and also what they need to see on those attributes, maybe by line of therapy, to choose an oncology example or any other particular therapeutic area where that might be applicable, and allowing them to fill in the information. It's very engaging for the physician. It's very engaging for the moderator, and I've been told time and time again as well, very engaging for folks in the back room as well. And certainly much more rich information comes out of that than a typical target product profile type discussion. So I told you I wouldn't tell you a lot about the process. Let me just tell you a little bit about it. Again, very important to set up the future competitive landscape. Again, we always squirm when we spend more than 2 minutes having physicians review the competitive landscape, but I'm willing to take 10 or 15 because I think it's that important. Situation dependent, I said I want to have them talk first. What I may do is I may tell them, depending on the product, what is the mechanism of action of the product and what is the indication at a minimum, because we have no ability to change that, or very little ability to change that. So let's start that as kind of as the baseline or the backdrop. And again, the basic instructions are, tell me, let's have a detailed discussion about your minimal expectations for product use. And stop them there. Not the ideal product. What would you minimally need to see this product deliver to prompt use of the product? Keeping in mind current and future products, and certainly there's a lot of intermittent reminders throughout that discussion as well. And as I mentioned, it's a very fine-grained discussion about, what are the study design, patient population, treatment arms, key comparators, what are the primary endpoints, what are the secondary endpoints, what is the magnitude of the benefit that you need to see on those endpoints as well, other attributes, and importantly, for those of us who really love target product profiles, and in the right context, I do, I often bring them back to the target product profile, looking up at that minimal expectation map that we just put on a chart in front of the table, or in front of the room. And you may not be surprised to hear it's often very anticlimactic when they respond to the target product profile. They'll say, that's pretty much what I told you. Or they might say, well, it's pretty much what I told you, but that efficacy parameter where I said it needs to have 20% improvement, you're offering me 10 or 15. All right, well, let's reconcile that. Let's talk about the implications. Let's talk about any trade-offs that you're willing to make. So you do get to evaluate the target product profile in that context at the end. So from a customer requirement standpoint, that type of research, you develop a very detailed customer requirement map for every respondent. I've had to get a bigger bag to travel with because I come home with many more flip charts than I used to. But it's very rich information. You then analyze all the maps to generate an overall map. And I think importantly, given part of the theme today, you generate a customer requirement map for each market and you document the key differences. Use customer requirements to inform the pivotal trials. And then I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek that you rest assured that you have optimized your competitive readiness. I would say at that point, well, almost. We're almost there. In the interest of competitive readiness, clients often have additional pressing needs and concerns. And again, I know that a lot of you will relate to what's up here on these bullet points. Now I have a good sense of customer requirements, but which of the requirements are most important? What are the drivers of product use and preference? What trade-offs are customers willing to make between the attributes? How often will my product be used? IO senior management, a preliminary forecast. Where is my business likely to come from? Which products are most likely to be replaced and displaced? And how are the answers to all of the above likely to differ by market? The answer to most of those questions would traditionally be done, let's do a conjoint study. And again, conjoint studies, if you just focus in on the US, they tend to be kind of large. They can be expensive. And when I multiply that by 8, 10, 12, 15 prioritized emerging markets, I would make the argument that they're not especially cost effective. What I prefer to do is something that is often used to euphemistically termed a qualitative conjoint. And one of the beauties, if they were no good, I wouldn't care about this first benefit, but I think they are good, and I'll share that with you shortly. What I often find myself doing is combining that minimal expectations discussion with physicians with a brief qualitative card sort conjoint at the end of that interview. It makes a great 60-minute interview because what you're getting is you're getting an understanding of the benefits of the product attributes that physicians need to see, but you're also getting a sense in the context of a qualitative conjoint about the trade-offs they're willing to make, about the key drivers, those sorts of issues as well. So as I mentioned, it's a card-sort exercise, and again, believe it or not, my methodologist tells me this and I have no reason to doubt him, these are statistically valid and have high internal consistency with as few as about 30 or 40 respondents, 30 or 40 physician respondents. Customers are exposed to multiple profiles, including the base case target product profile. Obviously, you can do the worst case, you can do the best case, you can do the minimal expectations case that you had just identified in the previous part of the discussion. We ask physicians to sort by preference and do an allocation, just as you would in a larger quantitative conjoint study. And this is the beauty from my standpoint, one of the beauties, is that we ask, and I'm sure other folks do this as well, ask customers to explain their preferences, allocations, and trade-offs along the way. In terms of the benefits, some would term some of these benefits bias. I put them under the banner of accuracy. The qualitative context, in my way of thinking, is a big plus for a trade-off or conjoint analysis. The moderator is there to answer key questions. Is this all patients or just ones I treat with a prescription? Get that question a lot, and when you're doing this online, when you're doing it quantitatively, there's no one there to answer those questions, so it's really a crapshoot. It's to reinforce the future market landscape. Remember, doctor, this is not now. This is up against those 3 other products that are going to be available in the future that we talked about earlier during our conversation. Here's one that you might put under the bucket of biasing. I don't put it there. Is to challenge physician responses to the allocation exercise. If I just heard a physician tell me that this product does not meet their minimal expectations, and now they're telling me they're going to use it for 100% of their patients, I think that's license for me to challenge their answer and to come up with a better answer. And engage in follow-up qualitative discussion of key drivers, trade-offs, and source of business. Again, we do not have the opportunity to do that in a quantitative study. And again, it further informs clinical trial design, feeds the forecast, and provides understanding. And again, as I mentioned, we can do that to model the base case, the worst case, the best case, and the minimal customer requirement scenarios as well. And it does permit direct feedback from all prioritized markets, because again, this is not often a second study, it's the second half of that customer requirement study. And I think looking around the room, I think we've probably done this for a couple of folks in this room, and I think that whole notion of identifying minimal expectations and then modeling it through a qualitative pre-sim gives us a really good early sense of what should clinical trial designs look like and what implications does that have from a forecasting standpoint as well, from a product utilization standpoint. And I think very importantly, again, we've all been around long enough to say, all right, we've got these conjoint analyses. Basically, what do we do with the fact that it's projecting or it's coming out with a 45% market share? The standard response is multiply it times 0.5, which never felt too good to me because you're taking a very good quantitative methodology and just qualitatively saying cut it by 0.5 for no good reason. I much less often feel the need to say multiply this times 0.5 after coming out of a qualitative discussion because I understand the issues. We're there to help guide the physician through the process to critically think about their answers than I am when I do a quantitative study. So then I talked a little bit about this already, and I won't labor on this issue. I think there's an opportunity to go a step further, and that's to understand the positioning concepts that we want to reinforce about the product. Because again, understanding that physicians need to see a 20% improvement in progression-free survival in this new oncology drug is a little bit different than saying how we want that to be positioned or how it's optimally positioned in the physician's mind from a positioning standpoint. So again, as I mentioned before, I like to understand kind of a prioritization of positioning strategies, high-level positioning strategies, what's most influential to the physician, to the patient, and then structure, and then ask the question, what do you need to see to support that, and then structure clinical trials, if possible, to deliver on that notion. I think an important level of complexity, which I mentioned before, is this whole idea of portfolio development. The reason I love portfolio development is as if positioning an individual product wasn't hard enough. When you start to say, now let's think about how we're going to position this 5-product scenario where one product's going to be introduced this year, another one in 2013, with all these other market complexities. It's a very challenging task at hand. It's very fun. But also there are additional complexities when you bring in this notion of the emerging market focus. The prioritization of products for emerging market. Some of the products are better matches than others, which is an important consideration as you look at the markets. There's also the prioritization of markets for our portfolio as well. In the short term, our currently established product might not show much opportunity in some of these emerging markets, but some of these emerging markets, it may cloud the long-term opportunity for other products that we have. So we may make the somewhat hasty decision in the short term not to get involved in this emerging market, when what we should have done is established our market presence, which again is important in many of these emerging markets because they do value the brand that is the company often, in the interest of developing, nurturing that market for the somewhat longer term opportunity. And as I mentioned, many of these countries do value a critical mass as well. So again, important portfolio implications. And also entry into these new emerging markets may entail simultaneous rather than sequential positioning of the portfolio. Again, if we make the decision to go into Turkey as a company or to commit to Poland, those sorts of things, we might be introducing 5 cardiovascular products all at once, or 5 oncology products all at once, which does call for a portfolio approach to commercialization of the products. So again, I'll probably fly through these relatively quickly, but just key principles in conducting these types of studies, which I just mentioned in these emerging markets. It starts with the nomenclature. I've been saying emerging markets, emerging markets, emerging markets probably for about an hour plus now. And what I should be saying is markets. Emerging markets somehow, to me, has the connotation that they're somehow lesser than, they're not as important as. Let's just call them markets. They're just markets. They're no less, they're no more important, and we have to treat them like other markets as well. Part of my presentation out at PBIRG, it was kind of a beyond the bricks type focus. My counsel here is in going beyond the bricks, let's not forget about the bricks as well, because I think we have a pretty good understanding of what's happening in those markets, but there's a lot of untapped information that we need to understand and identify there too. Acknowledge an exacerbation of an inherent contradiction. We desire to set up a global strategy, but in many commercial platform components, they must be local. Build the marketing research infrastructure and expertise within each of these markets. It's probably one of the most challenging things that I've experienced over the last couple of years. Having done global research in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere, more of the, quote, traditional ex-US markets, I feel that we've got as I'm sure a lot of you folks do as well, a very good network of local moderators that we've identified, nurtured. We know they're going to do a really good job. We know they understand the markets. We know they understand us. Truthfully, we do a lot of emerging market research, but we're just now kind of nurturing that emerging market moderator and partner network. So it's something that really needs to be focused in on over the course of the upcoming years. Involve local affiliates in the research process. I know there are a lot of obstacles to doing that, but I've always found that the best positioning workshops, the best research that I've gone into after those positioning workshops has always involved some level of local affiliates to provide some insight not only into development of the potential positioning strategies, but to understanding some of the opportunities and challenges that the markets provide. For both marketing research vendors and local client affiliates, education is needed on marketing, positioning, and the like. Again, in a lot of these emerging markets, they don't have I guess what I would term veracity for pharmaceutical marketing and research. A lot of marketing and research capabilities are much more focused in on the consumer end of things. So we need to provide the opportunities for our local affiliates to learn, to be a part of the process. It's not a damning statement to say that a lot of local affiliates don't necessarily understand the positioning, the commercialization process as well as we do potentially in coming together for some of these workshops. In a lot of cases, they haven't been involved. I think we need to involve them. A lot of times what we'll end up doing is doing these learning circles as well. We've historically included this, a lot of my clients have historically included Spain a lot more often than they have Mexico, for example. So the idea of setting up affiliates from Spain in the same learning circle as affiliates from Mexico provides a good opportunity to share some of that information. And again, as I mentioned, build the network of moderators over time. In establishing and communicating market research expectations, I would err on the side of being conservative and use Japan as a prototype for some of these emerging markets. They're different culture, different values. In Japan, focus groups are not a good idea. And again, kind of a learning process over the last several years. You get to learn what you can do from a methodological, from a logistics standpoint, and what you can't do. And often it's a different answer by country.
If you can't use Japan,
what's that?
If you can't use Japan, who else would you recommend? Because Japan is so expensive.
I would say do 3 days of 3 IDIs a day, and I was going to make a joke there, but I can't even think of a joke. I mean, we go to South Korea a lot. It's not a great substitute for Japan. Sometimes there's no way of getting around doing it, but we do South Korea a lot. We're frequently in China, and China and Japan are very much disparate. But sometimes you have to suck it up and do research in Japan. Don't assume. Ask even the most seemingly basic questions in designing the study. And a somewhat embarrassing situation for me recently was I went over and did some ARB research, some positioning and message development research for an ARB, an unnamed ARB in Turkey. And we said, let's split the sample, half cardiologists, half primary care physicians. We got over there and we found out that primary care physicians were not allowed to prescribe ARBs in Turkey. So it's hopefully, those are questions we need to ask. An embarrassing situation for me at the time, but it's certainly something we learned from over the course of the years. As the global marketing research agency managing the project, we strongly adhere to the basic philosophy. We navigate and steer, the local moderators row. And what that cryptic statement essentially means is there needs to be this point person, and often in our case, it's always a US-based company, that being us, that is involved, that's responsible for the strategic direction of the study, and we certainly would not want to abdicate that responsibility. In any case. Engage in a detailed briefing session with emerging market moderators and focus on objectives rather than just reading the discussion guide. Continue to identify the right issues and ask the right questions. I think in a lot of cases now when we go from US research to G5 research, we're often saying, here's the discussion guide that we used in the US, go translate it. We can't do that in emerging markets because there's a lot of issues, as I talked about before, that we need to understand and identify as part of doing a message testing study, a positioning testing study, an opportunity assessment. We need to understand the market landscape, so we need to include those types of questions, and they need to be customized by market. If possible, always initiate the research in the United States so emerging market moderators can observe. That's something that I strongly recommend that we all do if we're not doing it already. Adhere to all competitive readiness principles, particularly the need to set up the future environment, and we can certainly involve the local affiliates to do that. Let realistic expectations temper our desire to do more with less. Again here, I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek that if you challenge me to do a positioning, messaging, creative concept testing, logo testing interview in 60 minutes, I'll take the challenge. But it's my experience that in a lot of ex-US countries, especially emerging markets, that's not possible. So oftentimes we need to do baby steps in terms of the pace and also the scope of the research. And as a result, expect expanded timelines in a lot of these countries as well. acknowledge the potential need for market-specific methodologies. I think I talked a little bit about that before. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, and it often involves I won't say a contentious discussion, but an important discussion. Although budgets are tight, the global market research partners need to be at research. It's not just for my frequent flyer miles, and I would much prefer, to be at home with the family, but it's been very much my experience that the global marketing research partner needs to be there for at least one day of research to get the research kicked off. I don't think in 95% of cases that having somebody do so via video conferencing from their office in the US offers enough quality control to get that done. So these are often big ticket items. I mean, for a $250,000 project, it can be a $30,000 travel budget, which is more than 10% of the budget. But in my way of thinking, it's important that the global marketing research person be there. Don't expect all the comforts of home. Got a lot of examples that I won't either bore or gross you out with in terms of some of the limited, certainly don't have the comforts of home in a lot of these emerging markets. Just a few last key principles as well when we think about this research. Optimize the structure of the research and set up clear expectations in regard to the process. You always need to develop templates and those sorts of things when conducting this type of research. Contemplate, as I mentioned before, different methodologies for different markets. Obtain frequent updates on the market landscape issues. Many of these markets are quite dynamic and they often change rapidly. And I also like to get the simultaneous translator involved early. I always used to meet the simultaneous translator when I showed up for research. And I don't think that's the optimal way to use the simultaneous translator. They can help you with terminology, help you with nuances in language, those sorts of things when you're setting up things like creative concepts, when you're setting up positioning statements and those sorts of things as well. I just wanted to really end on, in our last, we have maybe about 10 minutes before questions, somewhere thereabouts? Yeah. Okay, good. I wanted to end on something I did not talk about at the annual PBIRG meeting. I think I had a little bit less time there. And when most people think about competitive readiness, I think they think about wargaming. And they think about objection handling. Nobody wants to call it wargaming anymore, which I find interesting. And in fact, in a lot of companies, they're kind of forbidden to use the term wargaming, given today's environment. And I think competitive readiness is a perfectly good substitute for it, and you're accomplishing the same thing. I do a lot of competitive readiness workshops, competitive readiness research, and I just over the course of the next few pages, maybe a lot of this more for your reference rather than me blitzing through all of it, is just some advice about how to set up the pre-workshop information that gets disseminated, how to conduct the internal competitive readiness workshop, core team development of materials, marketing research with customers, reporting, and also development of objection handling materials. Again, this is something that I love to talk about, but I'll try to keep this to about 5 or 10 minutes. In terms of the workshop itself, and again, I would anticipate that anybody that's been involved in these, I'll get some head nods along the way in terms of do's and don'ts. Provide a brief focused pre-read. I know there are cultures, there are pre-read cultures and there are non-pre-read cultures. And I'm pretty sure why there are some non-pre-read cultures, because I've seen binders go out about like this, which I'm sure nobody will read before or after the workshop. So really, it's provide a brief focused pre-read if a pre-read is necessary. Focus on pre-read on issues pertinent to objections as well. Again, I think a lot of time is needlessly spent on a market overview in terms of market share, growth curves, those sorts of things. That doesn't help me too much when I'm thinking about identifying strengths and weaknesses of my product and messages to counteract those strengths and weaknesses. Also, allocate sufficient time for the workshop. I know time is tight, priorities are disparate, but I think 1 to 2 days is usually enough. I was talked into, about 4 years ago, flying to the Czech Republic to do a 3-hour wargaming workshop. And the introduction, which was promised to me to take 15 minutes, took an hour and a half. So I had an hour and a half left for the wargaming workshop, at which point I said I need to take a 5-minute time out to figure out what the heck I'm going to talk about for an hour and a half. We got it done, but I think the general counsel there is to spend enough time where everybody is going to be engaged and you're going to really feel comfortable that you came out with a very good group of objections and also objection handling messages. Another common mistake that I see is biting off more than one can chew. What I want to get out of the objection handling wargaming workshop is what are the objections and what are we going to say to address them. And I think a lot of times what clients are tempted to do is let's go beyond messages, let's go beyond strategy to talk about tactics. And I think that falls in the category of biting off more than you can chew. Provide written documentation to help workshop participants. A workshop primer and workshop notebook of exercises is obviously very good. Establish ground rules before the workshop and enforce them during the workshop. Again, learn this the hard way. I was in a workshop one time where I kind of got blindsided. We had, I think, a day and a half on this one. And a couple of members of senior management came up and were not happy with the way the competitive landscape had been designed. We had attempted to wargame this product up against 2 of its competitors, when in fact there were 7 of them. So we spent the first half of the day debating, were those 2 the right ones? Should there have been 3? Should there have been 2 other ones? So establish the competitive landscape, establish the competitive structure before the fact, and then go into the workshop. Cross-functional participation is helpful, but no need to invite the entire company. Avoid wasting important time and, more importantly, interest and energy with kind of lecture mode background information. Again, I think the best of these workshops get through all of that background information in about 60 minutes, in about 90 minutes, perhaps supplemented with a nice pre-read. This is a really important one. Establish teams by product, but allow all participants to be on the home team for at least part of the workshop. I find out that it's much more, people are willing to invest much more of their interest and attention if that they feel like they're developing the strategy for the home team. And I can see that. If I'm sitting there for 2 days and you stick me on one of the competitors for the entire meeting, how invested am I going to be in that meeting? It's important. We need to set up those teams for each of the products, but it's important that they be part of everybody be part of the home team for at least part of the time. For each group, establish a leader, scribe, and presenter, ideally rotating. Include a member of the core brand team on each team because they often have the most information about the product and can answer questions, but don't allow them to dominate the group either. Allow for a catch-all team to capture customer objections that would not have come up as a result of direct counter-detailing. Obviously, plan and execute structured exercises to identify weaknesses and objections. I very much like a mix of large group and small group exercises. And in my mind, when I think about what's best for large group, what's best for small group, I often think the small groups are good when a product-specific brainstorming and developing is being done. And the large group is much better for reporting of these messages, for reporting of the objections, and then potentially refinement as well. Have the facilitators, that would be me or some of my colleagues, circulate among the rooms, present and discuss output from the small group exercises if time permits. And again, one important thing to remember coming out of these workshops is do not expect the development of pristine, research-ready messages. I think that wastes a lot of time in workshops. Should I say superior or better? Should I say this? Should I say that? What we're looking for coming out of a workshop is identification of the key objections, the general idea of the message, which then can be worked on and further developed by a core team after the fact. In terms of the research itself, a few words hopefully of wisdom here. Decide on an objection handling or wargaming methodology. The way I think about these two things as being different is wargaming is whenever we're going to present information about a competitor to the respondent audience. That's more of a wargaming. More objection handling is we just present information about our product, live and in person, and then identify objections to that, and then test messages as well. But realize that you can do both. That instance in which I just mentioned about the study where we identified 2 competitors. Well, at the end of that half a day, we could not decide. My client could not decide on who the key competitors were. So what we did is we split the sample in the research, and conducted half of it as wargaming research against those two products in the context of focus groups, conducted the other part of it as IDIs in an objection handling type setting where we didn't focus them in on those two particular products, allowed them to bring up objections in relation to the entire universe of competitors. So understand that you can certainly do both. Again, know thy market. I usually like to limit the number of core competitors to 2. Let's see. Also put the competitor's best foot forward. Oftentimes in wargaming research, you have a faux sales representative go out there and deliver the product message. And often for the home product, they're jogging out there, springing their step, presenting the best message. And then you have the competitor come in, and you tell them to deliver the best message they can, but a lot of times you can tell their heart isn't in it. You really need to put each product on an even footing in that regard as well. One of the things, again, I think relatedly, is to utilize a live sales representative for delivery of the detail, but insist on some degree of standardization. After all, we're there to evaluate the message and the product, not the messenger. So I don't like a lot of between group between interview variability. Defer all questions until the end of the presentation. Typically, they can be answered by the moderator. Set of time on product presentations to about 5 to 7 minutes. I make very judicious use of self-administered questionnaires in wargaming type research. For one, I think, very good reason. The words that they're going to say are going to be tainted by the opinion of the group naturally as a result of being in the group setting. I want to get the individual physician level feedback via self-administered questionnaire before I go to the group in a lot of different instances throughout the session. Engage in a detailed discussion regarding the strengths, weaknesses, placement and fit, and primary objections of the product. Tailor the rebuttal message. The rebuttal message is really anything that we've identified a priori as potential objections we might want to communicate to physicians. And also, and this is what I like about wargaming research, and if you've been involved in this, you probably do as well, is a lot of the objections, despite our best efforts in the workshop, a lot of the objections that come up have not been brought up in the workshop, or at least some of them. So a lot of times you're scrambling in the back room to come up with messages to address the objections. So certainly those are the two sources of objection handling messages. Don't feel compelled to offer all reps the opportunity to address objections. This may be one place where I differ from others who do similar things. When I come back, often when I instruct the sales representative to come back, I'm often happy with just the representative for the home product delivering the rebuttal message, allowing the moderator to play devil's advocate. A lot of times if you allow every sales representative to come back and give a rebuttal, it's A, confusing, and B, you're beyond a 2-hour focus group now to a 3-hour focus group. Walk away from each interview with a clear sense of prioritized objections, degree addressed, information required to address residual concerns, and the likely impact if objections are not addressed. And I think lastly here, in terms of the report, I mean, I sit down whenever I write one of these up and I think about here's what I need to do. Clearly prioritize the objections and the information needed to address what's worth fighting for. Prioritize objectives by physician specialty, behavior, attitudinal segment, and market. Really interested in developing a toolkit for sales representatives to address these objections. I think that's one case, one instance where some of this research often falls short. I think in a lot of cases we're developing messages to objections without a lot of thought about how they will be executed in practice. And again, I think that needs to be discussed as well. Acknowledge regulatory restrictions, but be aspirational in terms of what some of our messages will be. Categorize objections based on whether they are best addressed proactively or reactively. Again, I think this is very important. But the very notion of objection handling research, to me that has connotations of these are messages that are going to be used reactively when a physician voices concern about my product. However, physicians, given limited involvement in what you're talking about perhaps, may not voice those concerns. So we really need to ask ourselves, based on what we heard qualitatively, should I deliver this proactively to all physicians or to a segment of physicians, or do I wait for the physician to bring it up? And there's a lot of aspects that go into that decision process. Communicate whether the optimal objection handling approach is direct or indirect. If some physician brings up, for example, a strong objection that my product is associated with 23% of patients have diarrhea with my product and my competitor has 10. Now what do I do? Do I directly take on that objection, or do I somehow indirectly take on that objection by portraying my product as having nonetheless a favorable risk-benefit ratio? So again, it's not always, as you likely know, not always necessary to take that objection directly on. Sometimes an indirect approach should be contemplated and adopted. So just, I know a lot of information here. In summary, what I like to, what I hope to get across here was adopt the competitive readiness mindset early, commit to emerging markets, obviously after due diligence in terms of prioritization, establish the global strategy and local variability, and also focus on the product and the portfolio opportunity and strategy. Again, that's something I've been preaching for several years now, is to really, especially when it comes to emerging markets, look at that, consider the product-related opportunity in the context of the portfolio. Consider your company opportunity in these emerging markets in the context of the portfolio. So with that, I'll take a breath and ask if anybody has any questions. Yeah?
In doing market research on new products, which you're advocating, a couple of problems that I've had are, first of all, the uncertainty of what your competition is going to be.
Right.
You don't know what your product's going to be like, you don't know what your competition is going to be like. And then I found that physicians have particularly difficulty putting themselves into the future. They really can only react to how they are in the moment.
Right.
Do you have any suggestions for how to overcome these challenges?
Two very good questions. I think the first part is, it's very much reliant on competitive intelligence. So I mean, physicians can only respond to the information that we give them. So it's incumbent upon us, to get as much information as we possibly can. And the second part of the question is, again, very much why I like the qualitative methodology. I think, to be honest with you, I think the better moderators, and I've encountered many of them, fortunately, in our industry, many of the better moderators are capable of getting physicians to think about future landscapes and the way it's going to look like in the future. And in a lot of ways, it's being as diligent as you can possibly be to remind that these three products that we've gone over, those will be available. Here's what they look like. Let's talk about the product in that context. It's not perfect, I admit, but you just need to be a bulldog when it comes to continuing to remind physicians of that of the landscape. Yeah, Steve.
I mean, you kind of described the ideal world.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
With limited resources. You guys are you aware of any benchmarking on teams that, because you might get some pushback from teams because of that uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We don't know what we have yet.
Mm-hmm.
Let's wait until we get our phase 3 data, then we'll do all this stuff
Right
before we launch. Is there anything like that that's kind of shown this work being done at a very early stage?
Well, I think the benchmarking piece of it is, again, an uncertainty. I mean, we're as good as our decision resources and other types of resources that we have available to us to help predict what's coming along, and our competitive intelligence. I guess I would make the argument that in order to inform phase 3 clinical trial design and the makeup of my product, which is largely what I've talked about here, I would much rather base that on informed, albeit somewhat incomplete, information about the future landscape than no information about the future landscape. So again, I think it's far from perfect, but I really want to go into phase 3 clinical trial design with the best understanding that I have about what the primary endpoint should be, what the active comparator should be if appropriate, what is the magnitude of the benefit that I need to deliver to make this a viable product. And again, you've heard my pet peeve. I'd really like to understand what are the potential positioning platforms that I might be able to pursue, and how can I best set up clinical trials to address those. So again, I think the answer is incomplete information is better than no information, assuming that the incomplete information that you have is at least somewhat accurate. Yeah. Yes.
Building on the Karen's point, so clinical trials take so long to set up, and that when the protocol is approved, it's with the standard of care at the time, and often standard of care changes, so that by the time you're launching, you may have a new standard of care, and you have no clinical data against that standard of care. Do you have any recommendations for how to not only put them into that mindset that there are these other available agents, but their standard of care may be different, so it's a very complicated.
It's a really good question as well. I think one of the things I skimmed over here was involving key opinion leaders as well. So I think there is a key opinion leader component to a fair number of these studies, because they might not have perfect insight into the future, but I would argue they have better insight than some of the community physicians that we talk to. But I do certainly, I think my bias is, over the course of the last having done research over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, that this minimal expectations discussion about what physicians need to see fits much better with specialists than it does primary care physicians. I try not to give away too much information on this product, but for example, in doing an oncology minimal expectations discussion, physicians are able to say in this particular treatment area that here's what I do today from a chemotherapeutic standpoint, and then it's to ask the question, what do you think you're going to be doing in the future? Do you see a trend toward anything else? And the trend in this particular case was toward Alimta. So even though it was not the standard of care today, oncologists are able to see it being the standard of care in 2 to 3 years. And in this particular instance, it changed the active comparator that the company was going to put in clinical trials. So again, involve KOLs, and I think better done with specialists than it is with primary care physicians. Because I agree, I oftentimes don't get a lot of good future thinking information to inform trials when I'm talking with primary care folks. Questions? Yeah.
Just one thing, in the past I've done a lot of work with new products, and one of the things that I think is so key is that we tend to focus just on the drug, and there are a lot of things that are really happening within that marketplace. You can't treat the disease if you can't diagnose it. Right. So I think if by talking to, and I've done a lot of work with KOLs, but looking at the diagnostic arena, look at surgical interventions. I mean, look what happened. Gallbladder surgery used to be the #1 surgery. Yep. So, I mean, I think that I think we tend to just look at this drug like the world is, these are the patients, X number of patients have this disease. It affects the elderly. We're getting more elderly. Therefore, it's going to be a bigger disease. Yep. But because of that, there are other factors on how to manage that, how to slow the progression. So if you have a drug for a late stage, say, congestive heart failure, but all the other drugs that are going to be out in the near future are going to slow the progression. Right. I mean, there goes that whole market. I agree. So I think we tend to, I worked for a while in the diagnostic area, and it was really interesting because they'd have all these drugs for diseases that we couldn't yet diagnose. And, that was the whole thing is, how do we know what the market potential is? Yep. So I just think to have a broader angle, especially earlier on.
Yeah. Again, I think a couple of different thoughts there too. I mean, that's one of the reasons, we talked a little bit here about not only the product focus, but the market focus, the notion of identifying the complete landscape, diagnostic instrumentation, diagnostic procedures. That's certainly one aspect of the market that you need to take into account. Not only in emerging markets, but I think in the U.S. as well. As I look at that great SWOT analysis in the sky, I mean, I think that the scale is being tilted toward the direction of threats to our products rather than opportunities. That's not to say we can't turn some of those threats into opportunities. And it's, to your point, it's not just about the product. It can be about the market or the ancillary product as well.
Vaccines, I mean, is another major area that can have a major impact on the prevalence of some of these.
Yep, exactly. And oncology is a great example there too, because oftentimes, I think to your point that you had made as well, you're largely looking at, in some cases, the unknown 3 to 4 years down the road. So you've studied your product in the context of what you thought the environment was going to be. But a lot of times in oncology, if you do not prove, as you know, that your drug works after the first-line drug, or that the product you're going to replace is effective after your drug, physicians are relatively hesitant to go there. So I think there's obviously a lot of moving parts, and those moving parts are contingent and dependent on the specific therapeutic area. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Sure.
Some of the things you're proposing, such as improve more market with early outreach marketing.
Yep.
And present go against the fact that living in a world of much smaller budgets,
Mhm.
they are shrinking anymore. Where are you making the trade-offs today?
I think there's something that I didn't mention, I think early on, is the whole notion of going to the emerging markets, going to multiple emerging markets, not just 5, but to 10, 15, 20, is largely being driven by my clients. They recognize that the growth opportunity, based on some of the information that I presented and some I did not present, the growth opportunity, everything being considered, is perhaps greater in these emerging markets than it is the US and the G5. So they're telling me to go there and do research. And I guess what I'm trying to do is trying to cost effectively, and I think other folks are trying to do this too, I can't say this is me, trying to cost effectively as possible, identify and whittle down the markets for each portfolio and each product, and then understand the nature of the opportunity, and then do cost-effective research with them. And under that banner of cost-effective research, again, I think that minimal expectations discussion, then with that so-called qualitative conjoint, that's a great 1-2 punch, which when all is said and done, is very cost-effective, I believe. Other questions? Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.